Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to a time when your inner monologue was considered a public health hazard, and your personality quirks were treated with the same clinical concern we usually reserve for a leaking nuclear reactor. Imagine yourself standing in a muddy village square in the middle of the 14th century. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and a certain pungent aroma that suggests the local sewage system is essentially just a very optimistic downhill slope. You feel a bit out of sorts today. Maybe you're just tired, or maybe the rye bread was a little too moldy this morning. But in this world, there's no such thing as just having a bad day. Your neighbors are watching the way you blink, the way you sigh, and the way you hold your wooden spoon, looking for any sign that your soul has sprung a leak. You probably won't survive this without at least one person suggesting that a small demon has taken up residence in your left ear to play the drums. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to know where you are watching from tonight and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the muck of the village path, your boots making a wet, sucking sound that feels like the earth is trying to steal your footwear. Every step is heavy. In the modern world, you would call this burnout, or perhaps seasonal affective disorder. But here, the vocabulary of the mind is written in the language of the divine and the diabolical. There are no therapists, only priests with very old books and very sharp opinions. You see, the medieval mind doesn't distinguish between a chemical imbalance and a spiritual rebellion. If you are feeling a bit sluggish, it isn't because you stayed up too late watching the moon. It's because your bodily fluids are performing a poorly coordinated dance routine. This is the era of the four humors, a medical theory that is essentially the original vibe check. Everything about you, your health, your mood, your tendency to cry at weddings, is governed by the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you have too much of one, you aren't just sick, you are fundamentally off. As you pass the local church, the heavy iron bell begins to toll. In your world, this is just an alarm clock with a much better acoustic range. But here, it is a spiritual barrier meant to drive away the invisible terrors of the air. You stop and stare at the bell tower for a moment too long. This is where the trouble starts. In a society that demands total conformity, any deviation from the norm is a red flag. If you look too happy without a reason, or too sad without a funeral, you are inviting a diagnosis that usually involves a lot of prayer and possibly some very uncomfortable physical interventions. Mainstream historical records show that the medieval church was actually the primary institution for managing what we now call mental health, often providing a sanctuary for those who couldn't cope with the rigors of peasant life. However, care is a flexible term. It could mean a warm bed and a bowl of pottage, or it could mean being chained to a pillar because a local friar thinks your depression is actually a very stubborn imp. Historians still argue whether the medieval definition of madness was a genuine attempt to understand the human condition or simply a tool used to keep the weirdos from ruining the social harvest. You feel the itch of your wool tunic against your damp skin. It's irritating, a constant low-level sensory assault. You want to scratch it, but even that must be done with caution. If you scratch too frantically, someone might think you're responding to the itch of the devil. Everything is a sign. Everything is a symptom. It's like living inside a giant, high-stakes game of charades where the prize for losing is an exorcism. You look at your hands, calloused and stained with the gray dirt of the fields. You feel a strange sense of detachment, a feeling that you are watching yourself from a distance. To a modern doctor, this is dissociation. To the man walking toward you with a basket of turnips, You look like you're contemplating a career move into witchcraft. There is a quirky, fringe belief floating around the village, a rumor that some people have a stone of folly inside their heads. It's exactly what it sounds like, a physical rock that grows in your brain and causes you to act like an idiot. There are traveling surgeons who claim they can cut it out. Imagine a guy in a stained apron holding a rusty knife, promising to remove your social anxiety by digging around in your scalp for a pebble that doesn't exist. It's the medieval version of a lobotomy, but with more theater and significantly more chance of a fatal infection. You see him sometimes at the edge of the market, his table laid out with gruesome tools that look like they belong in a blacksmith's shop rather than a doctor's office. You keep your head down. You don't want him looking at your forehead too closely. The sun is beginning to dip, casting long, distorted shadows across the timber-framed houses. These shadows are the content of your daily life, the only cable television you have. You watch them stretch and twist, and for a second, you think you see a face in the grain of a wooden door. In the 21st century, this is pareidolia, the brain's natural tendency to find patterns in random data. In the 14th century, seeing a face in a door means a door is judging you. The pressure to be normal is immense because normal is the only thing that keeps you safe from the terrifying machinery of medieval law and theology. If you talk to your dog too much, you're not a pet parent. You're a suspect. If you prefer to eat alone in the woods rather than in the crowded, smoky hall of your master, you aren't an introvert. You're someone who is clearly plotting something with the forest spirits. You wonder if anyone else feels this way, this quiet, humming tension in the back of the skull. You suspect they do, but everyone is too busy pretending to be a perfectly balanced vessel of the Holy Spirit to mention it. It's a collective performance, a village-wide play where the script is written in Latin and the stage directions are, try not to look possessed. You reach the door of your own hut, the thatch roof sagging like a heavy brow. Inside, it'll be dark, smelling of old straw and the single candle you can afford to burn. As you step over the threshold, you realize that the line between sanity and madness isn't a wall, it's a tightrope. And today, the wind is picking up. You have survived another day of being sane, but the night is long and the dreams are coming. And in this world, even your dreams can be held against you in a court of law. You wake up before the sun has even considered making an appearance. The air in your small room so cold it feels like a physical weight pressing against your chest. Your bed, if you can call a sack of moldy straw and questionable feathers a bed, is damp from the humidity of the night. And for some reason, you are crying. You aren't just misting up, you are experiencing a full-on, nose-running, shoulder-shaking sob. In your old life, you just call this a Tuesday, or perhaps a reaction to seeing your bank balance, but here in the Middle Ages, your leakiness is a matter of intense public interest. You wipe your eyes with a sleeve that's more abrasive than a cat's tongue, feeling the salt sting your wind-chapped skin. You have to decide, and quickly, whether this emotional outburst is a sign of divine favor or a one-way ticket to being labeled a lunatic. The concept of the gift of tears, or donum lacrimarum, is the ultimate medieval status symbol. It's like having a verified blue check mark on your soul. If you cry while contemplating the sufferings of the world or the gravity of your own sins, you aren't mentally unstable. You are a spiritual athlete. Historians still argue whether high-profile figures like Marjorie Kempe were genuine mystics experiencing this gift, or if they were suffering from what we would now diagnose as postpartum psychosis, or perhaps a form of temporal lobe epilepsy. Marjorie was the undisputed heavyweight champion of crying. She didn't just weep, she roared. She would be in the middle of a perfectly normal church service, the kind where everyone is just trying to stay awake while the priest drones on in Latin, and suddenly she would start wailing so loudly that people literally tried to kick her out of town. To some, she was a living saint. To others, she was that one person at the movie theater who won't stop talking to the screen, only with more theological baggage. If you can frame your morning breakdown as a deep, agonizing realization of your own unworthiness, you might just get a reputation for holiness. People might even start asking you for advice, which is a terrifying prospect considering you can't even find your other woolen sock. However, if you cry because you dropped your porridge or because the sheer, crushing monotony of peasant life has finally broken your spirit, that's a different story. That is melancholy, and it is considered a very dangerous clinical condition. Melancholy is a result of having too much black bile in your system. It's a cold, dry humor that turns your thoughts into a dark, stagnant pool. While the gift of tears is like a spiritual power wash for the soul, melancholy is more like your brain's internal plumbing has backed up and started leaking into your personality. You stand up, your joints cracking with a sound like dry kindling. Every movement is a chore. The sensory details of this world are a constant low-grade assault. The smell of the hearth, charred oak, and old ash mixes with the scent of the damp floor. You feel the grit of the dirt between your toes. In a world without antidepressants or even a decent cup of coffee, your emotional state is a precarious thing. 1 minute, you're a devout weeping willow, and the next, you're just a village weirdo who can't stop leaking fluids from his face. It's a delicate performance. You have to make sure your tears look holy enough. Too much snot, and it's a medical issue. Just enough glistening moisture and you're a candidate for a stained glass window. There's a quirky, fringe belief that the eyes are actually the vents of the brain. The idea was that if your brain got too hot from thinking about sin or if your humors were bubbling over, the steam had to escape somewhere and tears were the condensed result of that internal pressure. It's a very literal way of looking at emotional release. If you didn't cry, it was believed your brain might actually cook itself in its own juices. So, in a way, your sobbing fit this morning might have just saved you from a literal meltdown. But tell that to the neighbor who just saw you wailing at a bucket. In this era, everyone is a self-appointed psychologist, and their only diagnostic tool is a mix of superstition and whatever they heard at the pub last night. You step outside, and the mud is already clinging to your ankles. It feels like the earth is trying to reclaim you, 1 inch at a time. You see the village priest walking toward the church, his robes trailing in the filth. He looks at you, his eyes narrowing as he spots your red, puffy eyelids. You quickly tilt your head down, pretending to be lost in deep, pious contemplation. If he thinks you are being visited by the Holy Spirit, he'll leave you alone. If he thinks you are just depressed, he might suggest a diet of bitter herbs and a stern talking to. Medicine in this period is really just polite torture with a theology degree. The treatment for excessive sorrow often involved balancing those humors, which might mean eating hot foods like ginger or, if you're really unlucky, a round of bloodletting to let the sad blood out. Because nothing cheers a person up like having a pint of their life force drained into a ceramic bowl by a man who also cuts hair. Mainstream historical facts tell us that by the late Middle Ages, hospitals like Bedlam in London were already starting to house those deemed distracted or furious. But for most people, mental health care happened in the community. It was a messy, communal effort where the line between a sign from God and a symptom of madness was thinner than a communion wafer. You walk past a small shrine at the edge of the path, where someone has left a few wilted flowers and a piece of bread. It's a reminder that everyone here is looking for a way to appease the invisible forces they believe govern their minds. You realize that your crying is a form of communication, a way to signal to the world that you are overwhelmed, even if you have to dress it up in the language of the divine. The pressure to perform your sanity is exhausting. It's like being on a stage 24/7 with no intermission, and the audience has the power to banish you to the woods if they don't like your character arc. You think about how modern people have it so easy. They can just say, "I'm having a rough day," and move on. You, on the other hand, have to turn your rough day into a theological masterpiece. You wipe your face one last time, the rough wool of your sleeve leaving a red mark on your cheek. You decide that for the rest of the day, you will be the picture of stoic peasant resilience. You will keep your humors in check, your bile balanced, and your tears firmly locked behind your eyelids. But as the church bell rings again, that giant metallic alarm clock reminding you of your duties, you feel a familiar prickle in the corners of your eyes. The gift, it seems, isn't finished with you yet. The sun is now high enough to turn the damp mud into a sticky, clay-like paste that clings to your boots, making every step feel like a deliberate act of sabotage against your own hamstrings. It's lunchtime. Though lunch is a generous term for what's currently happening in the village, you find yourself standing near a communal cooking fire where a large iron pot is bubbling away. The scent is unmistakable. It's a mix of overboiled cabbage, earthy root vegetables, and a lingering hint of whatever happened to that goat. It's less like a recipe and more like an ongoing edible experiment in how much fiber a human being can consume before they physically turn into a burlap sack. In your modern life, you'd probably call this a deconstructed vegetable medley and pay $20 for it, but here it's just pottage. And today, you've decided you don't want any. This is where things get tricky. In a world where food is scarce and most of your life revolves around this literal daily bread, refusing to eat isn't just a lack of appetite, it's a social and spiritual crisis. You stand there with your empty wooden bowl, feeling the hollow ache in your stomach, but the thought of that gray, lumpy stew makes your throat tighten. Your neighbors are already digging in with wooden spoons that have been smoothed by decades of use, their eyes occasionally darting toward your empty hands. You realize that by skipping this meal, you have accidentally entered the high-stakes arena of anorexia mirabilis, or holy anorexia. If you were a young woman in the 14th century, refusing food could be your only way to exert control over a life that is otherwise entirely scripted by men and the church. By starving yourself, you aren't just losing weight, you are gaining spiritual clout. Historians still argue whether these fasting girls were suffering from the medieval version of anorexia nervosa, or if they were using self-starvation as a legitimate, culturally accepted form of religious protest to avoid unwanted marriages or to gain a voice in the community. If you don't eat, you might be a saint. Or if the priest is having a bad day, you might be possessed by a spirit of gluttony that is playing a very confusing reverse psychology game with your digestive system. The village priest, a man whose nose always seems to be slightly redder than the rest of his face, wanders over toward you. He looks at your empty bowl, then at your face, which is probably looking a bit gaunt from the morning's crying session. He doesn't see a person who might just have a stomach bug or a case of the Mondays. He sees a potential theological problem. In this era, fasting is a tool, a way to sharpen the soul by dulling the body, but there is a very fine line between devoutly hungry and dangerously deranged. If you fast under the guidance of the church, you're an intern for the divine. If you do it on your own whim, you're a freelance ascetic, and the church really hates a freelancer. To help you visualize the gravity of your situation, imagine if skipping lunch today was treated with the same level of legal and medical scrutiny as performing an unlicensed DIY heart transplant. That's a level of concern we're talking about. You try to look pious, as if you are feasting on the word of God rather than the turnip water, but your stomach lets out a long, low growl that sounds like a disgruntled badger. It's a betrayal by your own biology. You try to cover it with a cough, but the priest's eyebrows have already migrated towards his hairline. He starts talking about the dangers of pride. The idea that you might think you're better than the common folk because you don't need the filth of the earth to sustain you. Mainstream historical facts point to figures like Catherine of Siena, who allegedly lived for years on nothing but the Eucharist and a few bitter herbs. She was a powerhouse of the medieval world, but her diet was a constant source of anxiety for her confessors. They were terrified she was being deceived by a demon who was essentially photoshopping her health to make her look holy while she was actually wasting away. There was even a quirky fringe belief among some medieval thinkers that truly holy people didn't need to eat because they could absorb nourishment from the smell of a rose or the sheer proximity to a relic. It was a scent-based meal plan that sounds like something a modern influencer would try to sell you for 3 easy payments of $99. You look down at the mud, feeling the dampness seep through the thin soles of your shoes. The sensory reality of being hungry in the Middle Ages is different than it is now. There is no snacking later. There is no fridge to raid at midnight. If you pass on the pottage now, you're committing to a long, cold afternoon of manual labor on an empty tank. This physical weakness is exactly what the medieval mind associated with mental instability. A weak body was thought to have thinner walls, making it easier for wandering spirits or bad air to drift inside and rearrange the furniture of your mind. By not eating, you're essentially leaving your front door unlocked in a neighborhood known for theological home invasions. The priest leans in, the smell of sour wine and old parchment clinging to him like a second skin. He asks if you're feeling heavy in the spirit. This is his polite way of asking if you lost your marbles. You have to be careful. If you say you aren't hungry, he might think you're being visited by a succubus that is feeding you in your sleep. If you say you're fasting for your sins, he'll want a full list of those sins, which, given how much time you've spent thinking about how much you hate this village, might take until next Thursday. You decide to take a small performative scoop of the stew. It tastes like wet dirt and regret, but it satisfies the social contract. You realize that in this world, your appetite is public property. Your gut is a battlefield where the forces of heaven and hell are fighting over the last bit of cabbage. You swallow the lumpy mixture, feeling it sit heavy in your stomach like a lead weight. You've avoided a diagnosis for now, but you can feel the priest's eyes on your back as you walk away. He's not convinced. He's seen the way you stare at the sky, and he's seen the way you cried this morning. To him, your refusal to eat is just another piece of a puzzle that is starting to look like a picture of madness. You trudge back toward the fields, the gray sky pressing down on you, thinking about how complicated it is to simply exist when every burp is a potential heresy. The day eventually yields to the indigo smudge of twilight, and you find yourself back in your hut, the small space smelling of damp earth and the lingering, ghostly scent of that afternoon pottage. You collapse onto your straw mattress, which, let's be honest, is basically just a high-density apartment complex for fleas. In the modern world, you'd probably pop on a podcast or scroll through your phone until your eyes glazed over, but here, the darkness is absolute and heavy. Your only entertainment is a theater of the mind. You close your eyes, and soon you aren't just a peasant with aching shins. You are soaring. In your dream, you are gliding over the jagged peaks of the Alps, the wind whistling through your hair with a clarity that feels more real than the itchy wool blanket currently draped over your legs. It's a high-definition 4K streaming service for your sleeping brain, and it feels spectacular. But then you wake up. The sun is poking through the gaps in the thatch, and you feel energized, exhilarated by the memory of flight. You make the mistake, the classic rookie medieval mistake, of telling your neighbor about it while you're both hauling water from the well. You describe the sensation of the air, the way the village looked like a tiny, insignificant toy from above. In your head, you're just sharing a cool story. In her head, she's calculating how long it will take to run to the local friar. You see, in the Middle Ages, having very vivid dreams isn't just a sign of a creative imagination, it's a symptom of a mind that is dangerously porous. Mainstream historical facts tell us that the church was deeply suspicious of the dream world. Figures like St. Augustine spent a lot of time worrying about whether a person was responsible for the sins they committed in their sleep. If you dream of flying, are you experiencing a divine vision, or is your soul literally leaving your body to go on a joyride with the wrong crowd. To the medieval observer, a dream wasn't something your brain produced. It was something that happened to you. It was an external visit. If your dreams are too detailed, too loud, it suggests that the barrier between your physical self and the spirit realm is thinning. You aren't just a dreamer, you're a person whose security settings are turned way too low, and that makes you a prime candidate for a mental health checkup that involves a lot of pointed questions about your relationship with gravity. Historians still argue whether the medieval obsession with dream interpretation was a way of early psychoanalysis or simply a method of social control. If you could control what people thought about their dreams, you could control their deepest, most private anxieties. You see the neighbor's eyes go wide as you describe the flight. She's looking at you the way a modern person might look at someone who just claimed they were being tracked by a fleet of invisible drones. She moves a few inches away, her wooden bucket clanking against the stone rim of the well. The sensory details of the moment, the cold splash of water on your feet, the smell of the wet stone, suddenly feel very sharp. You realize you've said too much. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit from the Friuli region of Italy involving a group of people known as the Benandanti, or the Good Walkers. These folks claimed that at certain times of the year, their spirits would leave their bodies while they slept to go fight witches in the fields to protect the crops. They didn't think they were crazy. They thought they were the local spiritual militia. But when the Inquisition got wind of this, they didn't see community service. They saw a group of people who had clearly lost their grip on reality, or worse, were in league with the very forces they claimed to fight. Telling someone you flew in your sleep is, in the eyes of the law, about 2 steps away from admitting you have a broomstick parked in the shed. You try to backtrack. You tell her, oh, it was probably just a moldy rye bread, hoping she'll buy the natural causes excuse. Ergotism, a type of fungus that grows on rye, was a real thing, often causing hallucinations and dancing mania, which we now know as a biological reaction, but they saw as a spiritual invasion. If you can blame it on the bread, you might just be sick. If you claim it was a vision, you're either a saint or a madman, and the paperwork for sainthood is a nightmare. You watch her walk away, her pace just a little too fast to be casual. Your stomach sinks. You've just turned your internal cable TV into a public broadcast, and the censors are going to have a field day. By the time you get back to your daily chores, the rumor has already started to mutate. By noon, the village telephone game has turned your dream of flying into a story about you levitating over the church. By mid-afternoon, people are looking at your feet to see if they're still touching the ground. This is the medieval version of going viral. But instead of likes and shares, you get suspicious glances and people crossing themselves when you walk by. The pressure of being watched like this is enough to make anyone act a little off, which, of course, only confirms their suspicions. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of insanity. You spend the rest of the day trying to act as heavy and earthbound as possible. You stomp your feet. You lean heavily on your hoe. You try to look like a person who hates the very idea of the sky. But the memory of the dream is still there, vivid and shimmering in the back of your mind. You realize that in this world, the most dangerous place isn't the dark forest or the battlefield, it's the inside of your own head. If you can't keep your dreams under lock and key, the community will do it for you. You think about the gift of tears from earlier, how some leaks are holy and some are mad. Apparently, the gift of flight is one that usually comes with a side of interrogation. As the evening bell, the town's massive bronze notification ping, rings out, you see the local priest heading your way again. His red nose seems to glow with a new sense of purpose. He's not here to talk about pottage this time. He wants to know about the wind in your hair. You stand there, the smell of wood smoke and old wool surrounding you, feeling like a fragile piece of glass that's about to be tested with a hammer. You realize that your normal brain function, the simple act of dreaming, has become a legal liability. You take a deep breath, trying to steady your humors and prepare to explain that your flight was actually just a very intense, very pious metaphorical meditation on the height of heaven. You just hope he hasn't heard about the Benedante yet. You are sitting on a hard wooden bench in the village church and your backside has officially gone numb. This is the weekly mandatory team building exercise with eternal consequences that we call Sunday Mass. The air is a thick, swirling cocktail of expensive frankincense, cheap beeswax, and the unmistakable, lingering bouquet of 40 unwashed peasants packed into a stone room with no ventilation. The priest is currently 45 minutes into a sermon about the vices of the tongue, and he's using a voice that sounds like two tectonic plates grinding together. In your modern life, this would be the point where you discreetly check your phone or start daydreaming about what's in the fridge. But here, your every facial twitch is being audited for spiritual compliance. And then, it happens. You remember, the way that turnip you saw earlier today looked exactly like the local count's nose. Bulbous, slightly purple, and aggressively lopsided. A tiny traitorous snort escapes your nostrils. You try to turn it into a cough, but it's too late. The dam has burst, a giggle bubbles up from your chest, and suddenly you're experiencing the medieval version of a catastrophic system failure. You're laughing. In a modern church, people might think you're just being a bit rude. But in the 14th century, an ill-timed chuckle is treated with the same clinical alarm as if your head had just started spinning 360 degrees. The priest stops mid-sentence. The only sound is the crackle of a candle and your own desperate, wheezing attempts to regain your composure. To the medieval mind, laughter is a dissolution of the self. It's a loss of control, a moment where the rational soul takes a coffee break and lets the animal spirits throw a rager in your brain. Mainstream historical facts tell us that many medieval theologians were deeply suspicious of laughter. There was even a long-standing debate based on the lack of any biblical record of Jesus laughing. He wept, he got angry, but he apparently never found a joke funny. Because of this, excessive mirth was often classified as a symptom of a sanguine humor that had become dangerously overheated. If you laugh too much or at the wrong time, you aren't just jovial, you're medically imbalanced, your blood is too hot, too fast, and it's pushing your brain toward a state of fatuity. You are effectively laughing your way into a diagnosis of being weak-minded. Historians still argue whether the church's crackdown on laughter was a genuine theological stance or simply a way to maintain crowd control during long, boring ceremonies. After all, if people start laughing, they stop being afraid. And if they stop being afraid, the whole hellfire and brimstone marketing strategy starts to fall apart. You feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing against you. It's like being the only person at a funeral who just realized the deceased is actually just a very convincing wax sculpture. The sensory detail of the moment is agonizing. The cold damp of the stone floor through your thin stockings, the scratchy wool of your collar, and the prickle of sweat on your forehead. You are the center of a very silent, very judgmental universe. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit about a condition called risus sardonicus, or the sardonic grin. In the medieval medical imagination, a person who couldn't stop smiling or laughing was often thought to be under the influence of a sardonic herb that curdled the facial muscles. Or worse, they were being mocked by a demon who was literally pulling the strings of their mouth. Some even believed that if you died with a smile on your face, it was a sign that you had been tricked into a state of false joy at the moment of judgment. Laughter wasn't a release, it was a trap. Your little chuckle about the turnip nose count has suddenly turned you into a prime candidate for a demonic, string-pulling investigation. To help you visualize the gravity of this, imagine if you were at a high-stakes corporate meeting and you suddenly started doing the Macarena while the CEO was discussing layoffs. That's the level of social glitch we're dealing with. You try to look down at your hands, focusing on a particularly interesting hangnail to try and kill the urge to laugh, but the silence in the church is so heavy it's almost funny in itself. You remember your dream of flying from last night, and for a second, the absurdity of your entire life hits you. You're a person who flies in their sleep, cries at buckets, skips pottage, and now laughs at the divine word. You are basically a one-person circus of medieval mental health red flags. The priest clears his throat, a sound like a shovel hitting gravel. He doesn't go back to his sermon. He begins to talk about scurrility, the sin of buffoonery. He looks directly at you, his eyes like two cold gray pebbles. He explains that laughter is the clattering of an empty vessel. By laughing, you have signaled to the entire village that your mind is hollow, a vacant lot where any wandering spirit can park its carriage. You can feel the neighbor who was so worried about your flying dream earlier, remember her? Shuffling even further away. She's probably convinced now that your flight wasn't a vision, but a symptom of a brain that has become too light and airy to function. You finally manage to choke back the mirth, but the damage is done. Your face is flushed, which in this world is just more evidence of your sanguine imbalance. Too much blood, too much heat, too much joy for a person who is supposed to be a miserable sinner. The pressure to perform a state of constant, low-level gloom is exhausting. It's like living in a world where the only acceptable vibe is contemplative funeral goer. Any deviation into actual personality is treated as a breakdown of the social and biological order. You realize that your laughter wasn't just a reaction to a funny thought, it was a system error in your performance of being a sane, medieval citizen. As the service finally ends, you are the last to leave. You trudge out into the sunlight, the bright glare making you squint and, heaven forbid, look like you're smiling again. You keep your face as flat as a board, trying to look melancholic, or at least phlegmatic. You walk past the stone wall of the church, hearing the whispers behind you. Did you see the way they laughed? A wandering mind is a playground for the enemy. You realize that in this village, your reputation is built on a very fragile foundation of not being weird. And today, you just took a sledgehammer to it. You look at the mud on your boots, the same mud that felt like it was reclaiming you earlier, and you wonder if maybe the madness they talk about is just the feeling of being too big for the small gray box they want you to live in. But you can't say that. You can't even think it too loudly. Instead, you just walk, your head down, trying to look like a person who has never seen a funny turnip in their entire life. You are a rational soul, again, or at least you're doing a very good impression of one. But deep down, the animal spirits are still hummed with the memory of that chuckle, and you know that sooner or later, they're going to want to come out and play again. You walk away from the church, and instead of turning left toward the fields where the rhythmic, soul-crushing labor of hoeing awaits, you turn right. You head toward the woods. You don't have a basket for berries, and you aren't looking for a stray sheep. You are simply walking. In your modern life, this is called taking a mental health walk or going for a hike to clear your head. You might even call it touching grass to ground your nervous system. But in the middle of the 14th century, walking without a destination is like driving a car in circles in a supermarket parking lot while screaming. It is a massive, flashing neon sign that your internal GPS has completely malfunctioned. To your neighbors who are watching you from the corners of their eyes while they beat rugs or sharpen scythes, your aimless wandering is a symptom of a deeply unsettled spirit. You feel the change in the air as you enter the shade of the ancient oaks. The smell shifts from the heavy, humid scent of the village to the sharp, cool tang of damp pine needles and rotting leaves. The ground here is softer, cushioned by centuries of forest debris, a welcome relief from the unforgiving, sun-baked mud of the path. But even here, you aren't alone. You feel the weight of the medieval moral surveillance system. In this world, there is no such thing as a private moment. If you aren't working and you aren't praying, you are vagrancy in personified form. You are a vessel for acedia, the noonday demon that makes people restless, bored, and prone to wandering. Mainstream historical facts tell us that acedia was originally a monastic disease. It was a state of spiritual listlessness that affected monks who spent too much time staring at the same stone walls. They would find themselves unable to focus on their prayers, their minds drifting to the world outside, and they would eventually just start walking. By the time you're trudging through these woods, the concept has trickled down to the common folk, to the village priest who is probably already adding aimless woods wandering to your growing folder of spiritual infractions. Your lack of a destination is a sign that your soul has become a vagabond. You aren't just moving your legs, you are wandering in the wilderness of the mind, a condition that medieval thinkers believed left the door wide open for all sorts of mental and demonic squatters. Historians still argue whether the medieval laws against vagrancy were actually the first rudimentary attempts at a mental health system, or if they were just a cynical way to manage the massive labor shortages that followed the Black Death. If you weren't tied to a specific piece of land, you were a threat to the economic order. But the cure for this kind of wandering wasn't a nice chat and a rest. It was often a stint in the stocks or a forced march back to your parish. You stop by a small stream, the water gurgling over smooth, mossy stones. You look at your own reflection in a pool. You look tired. You look like someone who has been trying to play a role they didn't audition for. In the 21st century, you'd be a digital nomad or a flaneur. In the 14th, you're just a distracted soul who is about 5 minutes away from being accused of talking to trees. There is a quirky, fringe belief from this era that if you wander aimlessly, your soul might actually leak out of your body through your mouth, especially if you happen to yawn or sigh while walking. People were genuinely terrified of losing parts of themselves in the landscape. This is why you see people crossing themselves constantly. They're basically trying to reseal their spiritual containers. Every time you sigh, which you do often, considering the humidity and the lack of decent footwear, you're technically risking a spiritual pressure drop. It's a very literal way of looking at mental exhaustion. You aren't just tired, you're physically losing the steam that keeps your personality inflated. To help you visualize the social catastrophe you're currently causing, imagine if you walked into your office today, ignored your desk, and just spent 8 hours walking in very slow, silent circles around the water cooler while staring at the ceiling. Your boss wouldn't ask if you were getting your steps in. They'd call an ambulance. That's how your village views your little stroll. They think your rational soul has gone on strike and left the animal soul in charge of the steering wheel. The sensory details of the woods, the rustle of a squirrel in the brush, the distant tap, tap, tap of a woodpecker feel like they're mocking you. They have jobs. They have destinations. You're just a human system error in a brown tunic. You sit down on a fallen log, the wood damp and slightly crumbly under your weight. You think back to the laughing incident in the church. Remember the turnip nose count? That moment of mirth was just the beginning. Now, this wandering is a logical conclusion. You are becoming unmoored. In the medieval diagnostic manual, which is basically just a collection of vibes and Bible verses, you are moving toward a state called alienation. It's the idea that you have become a stranger to yourself. You aren't finding yourself in the woods. You are losing yourself. And in a world where your identity is entirely defined by your relationship to your neighbors and your God, being a stranger is the same as being mad. A branch snaps nearby. You jump, your heart hammering against your ribs like a trapped bird. It's just a deer, but for a second, you were sure it was a village beetle coming to collect you. The pressure to be fixed to a point in space and a point in the social hierarchy is immense. You feel a strange, cold itch on the soles of your feet, another sensory hallucination brought on by stress, or perhaps just another sign. Some fringe medical texts suggested that wandering spirits could actually enter a person through the feet if they walked on unhallowed ground without a specific purpose. By just walking for the sake of walking, you are essentially inviting the earth to haunt you. You realize that you can't stay here. The longer you stay in the woods, the more wild you become in the eyes of the village. There's a deep medieval fear of the wild man, the person who has completely lost their reason and gone to live with the beast. You aren't quite there yet. You still want a bowl of pottage, even if it is gray and lumpy, but you are on the path. You stand up, brushing the damp wood chips from your clothes. You have to go back. You have to perform sanity again. You have to walk back to that village with a look of purpose, even if that purpose is just going to find a shovel. As you emerge from the tree line, the sun is lower now, casting those long, judging shadows again. You see the village in the distance, a cluster of timber, and thatch that feels more like a cage than a home. You take a deep breath, trying to settle your wandering soul back into its assigned seat. You remind yourself, don't laugh, don't cry, don't talk to yourself, and for heaven's sake, don't look like you're enjoying the scenery. You are a peasant. You are a tool of the Lord and the Lord. You have no destination other than the grave, and any detour into the woods is just folly. You start the long trudge back, your boots once again finding the familiar, sucking rhythm of the mud. You are back in the garden patch behind your hut, hands deep in the cold, unforgiving soil. Your fingernails are permanently stained a dark, earthy crescent, and your back feels like it's been used as a practice dummy for a medieval wrestling squad. To pass the time while you yank at stubborn weeds, you start to talk. Not to anyone in particular, just to the garden, to the stubborn roots, and honestly, to yourself. You're narrating your own life. And here, we find the peasant, once again losing the war against the dandelion. You mutter under your breath. In your modern life, this is just a harmless internal monologue that accidentally spilled out into the air. It's a way to process stress or just keep yourself company, but as you whisper a particularly biting comment about the quality of the soil, you notice a shadow fall over the patch. It's a village blacksmith's son, and he's looking at you like you just grew a second head that only speaks in riddles. To the medieval observer, talking to yourself isn't a life hack for productivity, it's an invitation to a seance. In a world where the air is believed to be thick with invisible entities, angels, demons, saints, and the lingering spirits of people who didn't pay their tithes, solitary speech is never actually solitary. If you're talking and no one is there to answer, the assumption isn't that you're thinking out loud. The assumption is that you finally hopped onto a conference call with the afterlife, and you're probably not talking to the customer service department of heaven. You are essentially using a Bluetooth headset without the headset. And in the 14th century, that is a first-class ticket to being labeled possessed or, at the very least, dangerously distracted. Mainstream historical facts point out that for much of the Middle Ages, the very concept of silent thought or reading was incredibly rare. When people read, they read out loud. When they prayed out loud. Even St. Augustine, a man who literally wrote the book on internal struggle, was famously baffled when he saw St. Ambrose reading a book without moving his lips. To the medieval mind, words were physical things that had to be released into the world. However, there was a strict social protocol for this. You spoke to others, or you spoke to God in a recognized setting. If you're just muttering to a turnip about your back pain, you are breaking the verbal contract of reality. You're speaking into the void, and the medieval church was very clear that the void is never empty. It's usually occupied by something with horns and a very bad attitude. Historians still argue whether the lack of private space in medieval life made the inner monologue fundamentally different from our own. When you live in a one-room hut with your spouse, 4 kids, a goat, and several thousand fleas, there is no internal. Everything is external. Your thoughts aren't private property. They are communal assets. By talking to yourself, you are privatizing your speech in a way that feels deeply suspicious. It looks like you're plotting. It looks like you're whispering secrets to a familiar spirit. Remember that flying dream? Or the way you laughed at the turnip nose count? Those were internal glitches. This talking is a broadcast error. You are making the invisible visible, and in this village, that's about as safe as juggling lit torches in a hayloft. You try to play it off. You look at the blacksmith's son and say, "Just praying for the harvest, boy. Go on now." You try to make your voice sound like a pious hum, but you can see the doubt in his eyes. He's seen the sign. You realize you have to be more careful. You have to keep the radio in your head turned down to a silent vibration. The sensory details of the garden, the smell of crushed mint, the damp coolness of the dirt, the rhythmic shush shush of your hoe suddenly feel like they're amplifying your own thoughts. It's a sensory overload. You feel the urge to speak again, to just say something to break the crushing weight of the silence, but you clamp your jaw shut so hard your teeth ache. There is a quirky, fringe belief from certain medieval folk traditions that if you talk to yourself, you're actually knitting a path for a spirit to follow your voice right into your throat. It was believed that a wandering word was like a breadcrumb for a demon. If you leave a trail of words leading to nowhere, something will eventually find the end of that trail and take up residence in the source. This is why silent contemplation was so strictly regulated in monasteries. It wasn't just about being quiet. It was about keeping the gates of the soul locked. By muttering about your weeding, you've basically left your front door wide open and put out a welcome mat for the nearest passing imp. It's the medieval version of leaving your computer, unlocked in a room full of hackers. To help you visualize the social catastrophe you're flirting with, imagine you're in a quiet elevator and you suddenly start having a very heated, one-sided argument with an invisible person named Gary about whose turn it is to do the dishes. That's a level of mental health crisis the blacksmith's son is currently reporting to his father. He's not going to say, "Oh, they're just eccentric." He's going to say, "The gardener is talking to the dirt again, and the dirt seems to be winning the argument." You've become a character in the village's ongoing drama of who is going mad this week. And unfortunately, you're currently the lead actor. The pressure to keep your thoughts inside your skull is making your head feel like a pressurized steam boiler. You think back to the gift of tears. Why is it that leaking water from your eyes is holy, but leaking words from your mouth is a psychiatric emergency? It's all about the vibe. Tears suggest a soul overwhelmed by the divine. Muttering suggests a soul that has lost its rudder. You are a ship adrift in a sea of black bile, and your talking is the sound of the hull cracking. You look at your hands again. They're shaking. Is it from the labor, or is it because you're terrified of your own voice? In this world, the line between sane and insane is often just the thickness of a closed lip. You decide to start humming instead. It's a safer middle ground. It sounds like a hymn if you do it right, a low, buzzing drone that covers the sound of your internal processing. But even then, you feel the moral surveillance of the trees and the mud. You are being vetted for sanity every single second. You realize that normal in the Middle Ages isn't a state of being. It's a full-time job of suppression. You have to suppress your dreams, your laughter, your appetite, and now your very voice. You are a rational soul trapped in a sensory prison, and the only way out is to pretend you aren't there at all. As the sun begins to set, casting those familiar, long-fingered shadows across your patch, you pack up your tools. You walk back toward your hut, passing the blacksmith's shop. You hear the clink, clink, clink of the hammer, a steady, sane rhythm. You see the blacksmith's son whisper something to his father, and they both turn to look at you as you pass. You keep your eyes on the ground, you keep your mouth shut. You're the picture of stolid peasant silence. But inside, your brain is still talking. A mile a minute, a conference call with 100 versions of yourself, all of them wondering how much longer you can keep the silence from breaking. You are sitting in the corner of your hut, and for some reason, you are terrified to move. It's not because of the wandering spirits you were worried about earlier, and it's not because your legs are tired from your mental health walk in the woods. No, it's much more specific than that. You have suddenly become convinced that your ribs are made of fine Venetian glass. You feel a strange, cold transparency spreading through your torso. If you breathe too deeply, you fear you might crack. If someone like that nosy blacksmith's son were to bump into you, you wouldn't just bruise, you would shatter into 1,000 glittering shards on the dirt floor. In your modern life, we call this being emotionally fragile, or perhaps having a thin skin. But here, it's a literal, clinical delusion. You're experiencing the medieval equivalent of a hardware failure where your brain thinks your body has been replaced by a luxury decorative item. This is the glass delusion, a phenomenon that sounds like a fringe internet creepypasta, but was a very real, very documented condition among the medieval and early Renaissance elite. Mainstream historical facts point to King Charles VI of France as the most famous shatter hazard. The man literally had reinforced ribs sewn into his clothing and refused to let anyone touch him for fear of a total structural collapse. Imagine being a king, the most powerful man in the room, and your biggest geopolitical threat is a stiff breeze or a particularly enthusiastic hug. You aren't mad in the way someone yelling at a turnip is. You are distracted by a very specific, very fragile reality. You feel the air in the room, the way it swirls around your glass limbs. It feels sharp, like it's looking for a flaw in your casting. Historians still argue whether the glass delusion was a specific manifestation of deep-seated melancholy or a cultural reaction to the emergence of clear glass as a luxury material. It's like how today people might have anxieties about their digital privacy or glitching in a simulation. In the 14th century, the new tech was glass, and the brain, bless its creative, stressed out heart, decided to incorporate that into its breakdown. You feel a strange sort of transparency of the soul. You think back to the way you've been acting lately, the crying, the laughing, the talking to yourself. Maybe you are glass. Maybe your invisibility is just you becoming a window that everyone can see through. It's a terrifying thought. You wrap your arms around yourself, but gently, as if you're handling a priceless heirloom you found in a dumpster. To help you visualize the sheer awkwardness of this, imagine if you were at a crowded music festival and you suddenly became convinced that your entire body was made of delicate smartphone screens. Every person walking past is a potential cracked glass nightmare. You'd stand perfectly still, your heart racing, while everyone else is just trying to find the taco stand. That's your life in this hut. The sensory details are overwhelming. The hard edge of the wooden stool, the coarse texture of your wool tunic, which now feels like sandpaper against your polished skin, and the way the light from your single candle refracts through your imagination. You feel brittle, you feel expensive, and in a village where most things are made of mud and pig iron, being expensive is just another way of being broken. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit about how people dealt with this. Some sufferers of the glass delusion were so terrified of shattering their glass bottoms that they refused to sit down unless they were perched on a large, soft pillow filled with goose down. Others would wrap their entire bodies in layers of straw, looking less like a person and more like a poorly packed shipping crate. You consider this. You look at the moldy straw of your bed, the same straw you were complaining about earlier, and for the first time, it looks like protective packaging. If you can just stay still, if you can just avoid the impact of reality, you might survive the night without a crack. It's a no-touch policy for the soul. The tragedy of the glass delusion is that it's a very polite form of madness. You aren't screaming, you aren't foaming at the mouth. You're just very, very careful. But in the eyes of the village priest, this is just more evidence of your alienation. He sees you sitting there, rigid as a statue, refusing to move even when a flea decides to explore your ear canal, and he thinks your humors have finally congealed. He might suggest a warming treatment, which in this era usually involves being wrapped in hot blankets or, heaven forbid, being forced to run around to thaw your blood. To you, that sounds like a death sentence. Being forced to run while made of glass is basically a demolition derby, for one. You realize that this fragility is a response to the hardness of your life. The medieval world is a place of heavy stones, iron tools, and blunt force. Your brain, seeking a way out of the crushing weight of being a peasant, has opted for transparency. It's a beautiful, if terrifying, form of protest. You think back to the gift of tears. Remember how those leaks were a sign of a soft heart? Well, the glass delusion is the opposite. It's a heart that has become too hard. So hard it has turned into crystal. You are a masterpiece of mental health mismanagement. You are a walking window, and you're terrified that the world is about to throw a rock. You spend the evening practicing the art of not existing. You move your hand to scratch your nose, and you do it with the slow, deliberate grace of a clockwork automaton. Every tink you hear, a spoon hitting a bowl, a pebble falling outside, makes you flinch. Your sensory experience has become a soundtrack of potential breakage. You think about the modern world, again, where stress is something you talk about over coffee. Here, stress is something that physically changes your molecular structure. You aren't just burnt out, you are tempered and chilled. You are a biological anomaly in a brown tunic. As a candle gutters and dies, leaving you in the thick, velvety darkness, the fear of shattering begins to fade, replaced by a heavy, cold lethargy. You realize that being glass is exhausting. It takes a lot of work to be this fragile. You decide that for tomorrow, you will try to be iron again. You will go back to the mud, back to the shush shush of the hoe, and back to the pottage that tastes like regret. But for tonight, as you lay down on your packaging of straw, you move with extreme caution. You don't want to wake up as a pile of shards. You close your eyes, the memory of your flying dream returning to you, and you realize that flying is the only safe way to be made of glass. No impact, no friction, just the clear, cold air and the silence of the sky. You wake up the next morning feeling less like a collection of fragile Venetian shards and more like a heavy, rusted hinge. The glass delusion has retreated back into the dark corners of your subconscious, leaving you with a strange, jittery energy that feels like a swarm of bees has taken up residence in your marrow. You head toward the village square, hoping that the mundane reality of the morning market, the haggling over wilted leeks, the smell of damp wool, and the sound of someone complaining about the price of salt will ground you. But as you turn the corner, you realize the vibe has shifted. It's not the usual bustle. There's a rhythm in the air, a thump, thump, thump that isn't coming from the blacksmith's hammer or the church bell. It's coming from the ground itself. In the center of the square, a woman you know, the one who usually spends her days quietly spinning wool, is dancing. But this isn't a festive jig or a wedding celebration. She is moving with a frantic, jerky intensity, her arms flailing like she's trying to swat away invisible hornets. Her eyes are wide, glazed over and fixed on a point somewhere behind the clouds. Her feet, bare and already bleeding from the rough stones, are slapping the earth with a repetitive, mechanical precision. In your modern life, you'd think you'd wandered into a very intense, very poorly funded flash mob, or perhaps a rave that has gone on for 72 hours too long. But here in the Middle Ages, you are witnessing dancing mania, or what the local authorities call St. Vitus's dance. Mainstream historical facts tell us that these dancing plagues were actual, documented events that could seize entire towns for weeks at a time. The most famous one occurred in 1518 in Strasbourg, where a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and started dancing, only to be joined by hundreds of others within a month. People didn't just dance for fun, they danced until they collapsed from exhaustion, suffered heart attacks, or literally wore the flesh off their feet. To the medieval mind, this wasn't a party. It was a neurological kidnapping. You watch her, feeling the dust from her frantic movement settle in your throat, tasting the grit and the salt of her sweat. Historians still argue whether this was a case of mass psychogenic illness brought on by the extreme stress of famine and plague, or a biological reaction to ergotism, that moldy rye bread we keep talking about, which can cause convulsions and hallucinations. It's the ultimate nature versus nurture debate, only with more rhythmic twitching. If it's the bread, she's a victim of bad luck. If it's a dance, she's a victim of a spiritual contagion. You feel a strange, sympathetic twitch in your own calf muscle. The rhythm is infectious. It's like a song you can't get out of your head, but the song is a physical command that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your joints to help you visualize the sheer horror of this. Imagine if you were at your boring office job and suddenly your boss, the HR manager, and the guy from accounting all started doing the electric slide with such violence that they started breaking furniture and refused to stop for food or water. You'd be looking for the exit. But in the 14th century, there is no exit. The village square is the only stage there is. The sensory details are overwhelming. The sound of ragged, wet breathing, the smell of old adrenaline, and the sight of a growing crowd of people who are watching with a mix of terror and a weird, suppressed urge to join in. You remember your mental health walk in the woods? Remember how aimless that felt? This is the opposite. This is a destination with no map, a journey that happens entirely on 1 square foot of dirt. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit about how the authorities tried to cure this. Instead of telling people to sit down and have some water, many city councils actually hired musicians and built a stage, believing that the only way to get the dance out of someone was to help them dance it through to the end. It was like trying to put out a fire by spraying it with gasoline and hoping it burns out faster. Imagine a group of terrified bagpipers being forced to play for a crowd of people who are essentially dancing themselves to death. It's the original mosh pit of despair. You see a man with a small drum tentatively starting to tap out a beat near the spinning woman. He's not helping, he's just providing a soundtrack for the breakdown. The pressure to maintain your own composure is immense. You have to keep your feet still. You have to keep your arms crossed. If you move too rhythmically, you'll be sucked into the vortex. You think back to the gift of tears and the glass delusion. Those were solitary struggles. This is a communal collapse. It's as if the shared trauma of living in a world that wants to kill you has finally found a physical outlet. The dance is a system dump for a society whose hard drive is full of fear and superstition. You look at the woman's face again. She isn't smiling. This isn't joy. It's a seizure of the soul. The priest arrives, and for once, he looks genuinely out of his depth. He's throwing holy water, but the woman just incorporates the droplets into her frantic movements, shaking them off like a wet dog. He starts chanting about Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers and epileptics, but the rhythm of his Latin seems to only fuel the woman's pace. You realize that in this moment, the rational soul has left the building. The animal spirits we talked about during your laughing fit in the church, remember that turnip nose count, have taken full control. They aren't just laughing now, they're choreographing a tragedy. You back away, your heart hammering a counter rhythm against your ribs. You feel a profound sense of alienation. The idea that you are a stranger in your own skin. First you were a dreamer, then a mourner, then a wanderer, then a piece of glass, and now you are a spectator to a physical madness that threatens to pull you in. The sensory experience of the village has become a rhythm of the macabre. You find yourself staring at your own hands again, checking to see if they're starting to move on their own. You feel porous again, as if the barrier between your sanity and the woman's dance is nothing more than a thin sheet of damp parchment. As you retreat back toward the relative safety of your hut, the sound of the drum and the slapping feet follows you. It's a low-frequency hum of anxiety that you can feel in your teeth. You realize that normal in this world is just a temporary state of not currently dancing. You decide to go back to the garden, back to the shush shush of the hoe. Maybe if you can create your own rhythm, a sane, productive rhythm, you can drown out the siren call of the square. You spend the rest of the day hoeing with a desperate, rigid focus, trying to prove to the dirt, to the sky, and to yourself that your feet are firmly planted in the rational. But every time a bird chirps or a branch snaps, you flinch, terrified that the music has finally found you. You are standing in the middle of the village square, and the great bronze bell of the local parish church begins to swing. It's a massive, rhythmic clanging that vibrates through the soles of your boots and echoes in the very marrow of your bones. In your modern life, this is just a 14th century version of a high decibel notification ping or a particularly aggressive alarm clock. But today, the sound is different. Usually, the bell just says it's time to pray or someone's house is on fire, but today, you're pretty sure it's saying your name. Specifically, it sounds like it's telling you to go and tell the village priest that he's wearing his vestments inside out. Or perhaps it's suggesting you take another mental health walk into the woods. It's a low, metallic hum that seems to resolve into actual syllables. You tilt your head, straining to hear over the thump 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 of the dancing mania that is still happening near the well. Remember that. Poor woman. Now, the bells have decided to join the conversation. This is the point where your internal system update starts to look like a full-blown security breach. Hearing voices in the church chimes is a classic medieval sign of a mind that has become overly resonant. To the people around you, the bell is a holy object, a sanctified piece of metal meant to clear the air of demons and pestilential vapors. Mainstream historical facts tell us that bells were treated with immense liturgical respect. They were often literally baptized, given names, and even assigned godparents in a ceremony that looks a lot like naming your favorite Roomba, but with significantly more incense and Latin. If the bell is holy, then any message you hear in it must be from a divine source, right? Well, that depends entirely on whether the message matches the current political and religious vibe of the village. Historians still argue whether the famous voices heard by figures like Joan of Arc were a form of auditory processing disorder, a symptom of what we now call schizophrenia, or simply a culturally sanctioned way for a brilliant mind to process intuition in a world that didn't allow women to have opinions of their own. If Joan heard the bells of Domremy calling her to lead an army, she was a visionary. If you hear the bells of your village telling you that you're still made of glass, remember your fragile ribs from yesterday, you are likely to be diagnosed with a corrupted imagination. It's the ultimate double standard of medieval mental health. The line between a saintly message and a lunatic's babble is usually drawn by the person who has the power to lock you in a cellar. To help you visualize the sensory confusion of this, imagine if your local church bell or town hall clock suddenly started sounding like a 500-pound bronze Siri that only gave you cryptic, life-ruining advice. You'd probably try to factory reset your brain, but in the Middle Ages, there is no reset button. There is only the hum in your teeth and the persistent feeling that the sky is talking to you. You feel the vibration in your chest, a deep, resonant bong that feels like someone is striking a tuning fork against your soul. The air smells of ozone and the cold, metallic tang of the bell's voice. You look around at the other villagers. They are all crossing themselves, their faces masks of stony, unmoving piety. They hear a bell. You hear a podcast from the heavens that you didn't subscribe to. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit about the power of bells that suggests they weren't just for telling time. Some medieval thinkers believed that the sound of a bell could literally congeal the air, making it too thick for demons to fly through. It was a spiritual smokescreen. If you are hearing voices in that sound, it might be suggested that you have thin ears, a condition where your physical senses are so eroded by melancholy or black bile that the holy vibrations are actually leaking into your brain and turning into words. You are porous again. You think back to the way you've been leaking lately. The tears, the laughter, the wandering words in the garden. This is just the latest stage of your dissolution. You try to ignore it. You focus on the sensory details of the square to drown out the bronze voice. You smell the pungent, earthy aroma of the mud and the sharp, sour scent of the local alehouse. You watch a stray dog trot across the stones, its nails clicking in a sane, non-verbal rhythm. But the bell rings again, and this time the voice is even clearer. It's telling you that the dancing woman isn't sick. She's just hearing a different rhythm. You feel a dangerous surge of empathy. In this village, empathy for the mad is like having a cracked screen on your sanity. Once it starts, it only spreads. You look at your hands, which are still stained with the dirt of the garden. Are they your hands, or are they just tools being operated by the music in the air? The priest, the man with the red nose and the folders full of your spiritual infractions, walks past. He stops and looks at you, his eyes narrowing as he sees you tilting your head toward the bell tower. He asks if you find the voice of the church comforting. This is a trap. If you say, yes, it told me to tell you your hat is crooked, you're in trouble. If you say, no, it's just a bell, he might think you're a secularist or spiritually deaf. You have to find the middle ground of medieval sanity. You smile a thin, rigid smile, careful not to look sardonic like the people with the dancing mania, and mutter something about the beauty of the resonance. You are performing rationality with the intensity of a tightrope walker over a pit of fire. Medicine in this period would suggest that your auditory distractions are a result of your brain being too moist. The idea was that if your head was too full of phlegm, the sounds from the outside world would splash around inside your skull and create echoes that sounded like speech. The cure? Probably something involving drying herbs, a very boring diet of toasted bread, and perhaps a vigorous rubbing of your ears with salt. Because nothing cures a voice-hearing bell like a direct salt assault on your ear canals. You realize that your entire body has become a medical project for a village that thinks science is just theology with more leeches. As the bell finally stops swinging, leaving a heavy, ringing silence in its wake, you feel a profound sense of exhaustion. The pressure of being sane is becoming a physical weight. You think back to the gift of tears. Remember how crying was a release? This hearing of voices is the opposite. It's an input you can't turn off. You are a receiver for a world that has too much to say. You decide that for the rest of the day, you will stay away from anything that makes a noise. No bells, no drums, no clinking of blacksmith hammers. You want a world that is as silent as a grave because in the silence, you don't have to worry about what the furniture is trying to tell you. You walk back toward your hut, the long shadows of the late afternoon stretching out like the fingers of a giant bronze ghost. You realize that normal in the Middle Ages is a very narrow path, and you're currently walking it with one foot in a dream and the other in a dance. You just hope that tonight the only thing you hear is the sound of your own breathing and that it doesn't start trying to give you theological advice. You are a peasant, you are a tool, you are a rational soul trying to survive a sonic boom of medieval madness. And as you step over the threshold of your home, you realize that the silence is its own kind of voice, and it's whispering that you should probably go to sleep before the moon starts talking too. The silence of your hut should be a relief, but as you lie there in the gray pre-dawn light, you realize that the silence has a weight of its own. It feels like someone has replaced your blood with cold, thick molasses. Your arms are heavy, your legs feel like they have been carved out of damp oak, and the simple act of lifting your head feels like a feat of Herculean strength. In your modern life, you'd call this clinical depression, or perhaps just a very intense case of social burnout, after a week of weird looks from your neighbors. You'd probably book a therapy session or at least watch some videos of capybaras to feel a spark of joy. But here in the 14th century, your lack of get up and go is classified as a physical buildup of toxic waste. You are officially suffering from melancholy, the most prestigious and terrifying of the medieval mental illnesses. You feel the rough, damp straw of your mattress pressing against your skin and the smell of the room, a mix of oil, soot, wet thatch, and your own unwashed anxiety is suffocating. To the medieval mind, you aren't sad, you are clogged. Mainstream historical facts tell us that the entire medical world of the Middle Ages was built on the theories of Galen and the four humors. You have too much black bile or melancholia. It is a cold, dry humor, the dregs of the blood that should have been filtered out, but instead has stayed behind to curdle your spirit. Think of it like a slow internet connection for your soul. The data is there, but the bandwidth is being throttled by a thick, dark sludge that makes every thought feel like it's being dragged through a swamp. Historians still argue whether melancholy was a genuine ancestor to modern clinical depression, or if it was a distinct cultural performance, a mood that became fashionable for intellectuals and saints to adopt. If you were a wealthy poet, being melancholic made you look deep and thoughtful, but since you're a peasant who still hasn't finished weeding the garden, remember your one-sided argument with the dandelions? Your melancholy is just seen as a failure of your internal plumbing. The local doctor, who is essentially just a guy with a sharp piece of iron and a very confident walk, suggests that your humors have become adust. This is a quirky, fringe tidbit of medieval medicine. The idea that if black bile gets too hot, it burns and turns into a caustic, acidic vapor that rises to the brain and creates false images. To help you visualize the medical horror of this, imagine if your primary care physician told you that the reason you feel tired is because your liver is literally toasting your thoughts like a piece of sourdough. You'd want a second opinion. But here, the only second opinion comes from the village priest, who thinks your heaviness is a spiritual laziness. You look at your hands, those same hands that felt like glass just a few days ago. They don't feel fragile. Now, they feel like lead weights. You are a walking shadow, a person whose internal fire has gone out, leaving nothing but cold ash. The sensory detail of the room, the way the light hits the dust motes, making them look like tiny dancing demons, feels like an insult. Why is the dust moving when you can't? There's a light joke to be made about the medieval spa day that usually followed a diagnosis of melancholy. The cure often involved things that would make a modern wellness retreat look like a torture chamber. To warm and moisten your cold, dry humors, they might suggest you eat nothing but boiled chicken and drink watered-down wine, which sounds okay until they add the part about cauterization. Some extreme treatments involved applying a hot iron to the back of the neck to draw out the dark vapors. It's like trying to fix a frozen computer by hitting the motherboard with a blowtorch. You decide to keep your heaviness to yourself. You don't want any hot iron therapy today. You think back to the other glitches you've experienced. The dancing woman in the square was too hot and too fast. You are too cold and too slow. She was a fire. You are a puddle. You realize that sanity in this world is just the perfect lukewarm temperature between two different kinds of madness. You are porous again, but instead of leaking out into the world is settling into you. The dampness of the mud outside feels like it's seeping through the walls and into your bones. You feel a profound sense of alienation, that word again, as if you are ghosts haunting your own body. To give you a modern comparison, being melancholic in the Middle Ages is like living your entire life in battery saver mode. You're still functioning, technically, but the screen is dim, the apps are crashing, and you have no idea where the charger is. You watch the sunlight move across the floor, a slow golden finger pointing out all the chores you aren't doing. You remember the bell voices from yesterday. They're quiet today. Even the bronze Siri doesn't want to talk to someone this sluggish. You feel a strange sort of comfort in the heaviness, a realization that if you don't move, you can't break, like the glass, and you can't dance, like the woman. You are a rock. You are part of the earth. The sensory experience of your melancholy is a muffled one. Everything sounds like it's happening underwater. The clink clink of the blacksmith, the shush shush of the wind in the thatch, the thump of a distant drum, it all feels miles away. You are trapped in a cocoon of bile. You think back to the turnip nose count and the laughter that got you in trouble at church. That person, the one who could find humor in a lopsided vegetable, feels like a stranger you met at a party years ago. You wonder if that version of you is gone forever, buried under a layer of dark, cold sludge. As the day drags on, you realize that the village moral surveillance system is still active, even if you're hiding in your hut. Someone, probably the blacksmith's son, will eventually come knocking to see why you aren't in the fields. You have to prepare your performance. You have to figure out how to look piously tired rather than medically collapsed. You decide to tell them you've been contemplating the vanity of the world. It's a perfect medieval excuse. It turns your black bile into spiritual depth. It's the ultimate rebranding strategy for a brain that just won't start. You finally manage to sit up, your joints clicking like dry bones in a bag. The air in the hut feels thick, like you're breathing through a layer of wet wool. You realize that your sanity is a house of cards and the wind is picking up. First the tears, then the dreams, then the wandering, then the laughter, then the glass, then the voices, and now this heavy silence. You are a walking encyclopedia of medieval psychological distress. You take a deep, shaky breath, feeling the bile swirl in your chest, and prepare to step out into the mud one more time. You just hope that the dancing woman doesn't see you. You don't think you have the energy to even watch her, let alone join in. You are a rational soul in a sluggish vessel, and today the vessel is taking on water. You trudge out of your hut, the cold weight of the black bile still pulling at your heels like a physical anchor. You expect the world to be gray and muffled, a continuation of that sluggish, heavy silence we just left behind. But as you reach the well to splash some icy water on your face, you see them. Maybe it's the miller's son with the surprisingly clean jawline, or the daughter of the local weaver whose hair catches the light like spun copper. In your modern life, this is a crush. It's the butterflies in your stomach feeling that makes you want to slide into someone's DMs or curate a very specific playlist to accidentally show them your vibe. But here in the middle of the 14th century, that sudden spike in your heart rate isn't romantic. It's a clinical emergency. Your pupils dilate, your palms start to sweat, and you feel a strange, burning ache behind your eyes. You have just contracted amorherios, or love sickness, and according to the local medical community, you are basically a walking heart attack with a poetic license. In this world, being madly in love isn't a metaphor. It's a literal description of your deteriorating brain function. To the medieval doctor, your intense focus on this person has caused your animal spirits to get stuck. Imagine your brain as a high-speed fiber optic network where one single image, the way that person smiled at a turnip, has caused a massive data bottleneck. The spirits can't circulate anymore. They just stay there, staring at the mental JPEG of your beloved until your brain literally begins to dry out from the friction. You aren't just infatuated, you're suffering from a corruption of the imaginative faculty. If you don't get help soon, your sanguine humors will burn off, leaving you back in the cold, dry pit of melancholy, or worse, you'll simply waste away until your ribs, remember those glass ribs, finally give up the ghost. Mainstream historical facts tell us that love sickness was treated as a legitimate, life-threatening physical disease by physicians following the tradition of Galen and Constantinus Africanus. It was often categorized as a species of melancholy, but with a hot and manic edge. Doctors would look for symptoms like sunken eyes, a lack of blinking, and a pulse that was irregular and wavy. To help you visualize this, imagine if every time you felt a spark for someone, your doctor showed up to check if your internal plumbing was about to explode. It turns dating into a high-stakes medical drama where the first date is actually a diagnostic consultation. You stand by the well, clutching your wooden bucket, feeling your heart hammer against your chest like a trapped bird. You're terrified that the village priest, who is already keeping a burned book of your spiritual failures, will notice the way you're staring. Historians still argue whether love sickness was a genuine medical condition that people actually experienced, or if it was a literary performance inspired by the poems of troubadours. Was it a real illness, or was it just a 14th century version of main character syndrome? If everyone in the poems is dying of a broken heart, maybe you start to feel like you should be too. It's like how today people might perform their aesthetic on social media. In the Middle Ages, people performed their humors. But the sensory reality for you is very real. You feel a fever in the bone. The smell of the market, overripe apples, and damp earth suddenly feels cloying and suffocating because it isn't the scent of the person you're obsessed with. You are alienated again, a stranger to your own reason, all because of a well-timed wink near a basket of leeks. There's a quirky fringe tidbit about how doctors would actually diagnose the object of your affection. Since you might be too shy or too mad to name them, the doctor would hold your wrist and perform a pulse test. He would then start listing the name of various people in the village. When your pulse suddenly went wild and started leaping like a goat, the doctor would shout, "Aha! It's the blacksmith's daughter." It was essentially a medieval polygraph test for the horny. Imagine how terrifying that would be. You're trying to keep your crush a secret to avoid the social fallout, but your own cardiovascular system is a snitch. Your blood is literally shouting your secrets to a man who probably hasn't washed his hands since the last solar eclipse. To help you visualize the treatment for this, imagine if your therapist told you that the only way to get over your ex was to go on a very long, very boring walk while eating nothing but boiled lettuce and staring at ugly things. That was a real medieval suggestion. To cool the overheated imagination, doctors recommended distraction therapy. You were supposed to be exposed to unpleasant sights and smells to reset your senses. If that didn't work, they might suggest you just get married. Marriage was seen as the final drainage of the erotic humors. It's a bit cynical, really. The idea that the cure for a passionate, soul-consuming love is the mundane, daily grind of sharing a hut with someone who snores and forgets to empty the slop bucket. It's the ultimate vibe killer. You look at the person across the square. They're just talking to a neighbor, completely unaware that they are currently corrupting your imagination. You feel a surge of that sanguine heat, a feeling of mirth and terror all at once. You remember the dancing woman. Remember her bleeding feet. You feel like your heart is doing that same dance. You are a system error in a brown tunic. Your rational soul is screaming at you to go back to the garden and hoe some more weeds. Remember those dandelions? But your animal soul is currently busy writing a very intense, very illiterate poem in your head. The pressure to remain sane and balanced is becoming impossible when your internal climate control has been set to tropical storm. Medicine in this period would also suggest bloodletting as a cure. The idea was that your blood had become too thick and too sweet from thinking about your beloved. By draining a pint or two, they hope to let the love out. It's a very literal way of dealing with heartache. You imagine yourself sitting in a chair while a barber surgeon opens a vein, hoping that as the red fluid hits the bowl, the image of those copper-colored curls will finally fade. It's a gruesome unsubscribe button for your feelings. You decide you'd rather keep your blood and just suffer the brain fever. At least, the fever has a nice soundtrack of lutes and singing birds in the distance. As the sun continues to beat down on the mud of the square, you realize that your lovesickness is just another brick in the wall of your madness. To the village, you are a person who cries at buckets, flies in dreams, walks in woods, laughs at turnips, feels like glass, hears bells, sinks into bile, and now burns for a weaver's daughter. You are a walking diagnostic manual. You feel porous again, as if the very air between you and your crush is a conductor for a spiritual electricity you can't control. You take a deep breath, trying to steady your wavy pulse. You need to look phlegmatic. You need to look boring. You need to look like someone who thinks a weaver's daughter is just another person who makes cloth. You turn away from the well, the heavy wooden bucket splashing water onto your boots. The cold dampness is a brief, sharp reminder of the glass ribs and the molasses blood of your previous days. You realize that in the Middle Ages, sanity is just the absence of any strong feeling whatsoever. To be sane is to be a stone. To be mad is to be a person who actually feels the world. You trudge back toward your hut, your heart still leaping like a goat, and you realize that even if it kills you, this fever is the only thing that makes the gray pottage of your life taste like anything at all. But keep it down. If the priest hears your heart, he'll bring the leeches, and nobody wants leeches on a first date. The night has finally settled over the village like a heavy indigo blanket, and for once, the world is quiet. The dancing woman has finally collapsed or been dragged into a shed, and the bell voices have faded into a low, metallic hum that you can only hear if you really try. You are standing outside your hut, leaning against a timber frame, and you're doing something very dangerous. You are looking up. Specifically, you are staring at the moon. In your modern life, this is just stargazing, or perhaps a bit of astrophotography if you had the right lens. You might check a lunar calendar to see when the next supermoon is so you can post a blurry photo of a white dot on Instagram. But here, in the cold air of the 14th century, staring too long at the moon is like looking directly into the high beams of a cosmic ambulance. You are inviting lunacy to take up permanent residence in your skull. The moon isn't just a dead rock reflecting the sun's light in this world. It is a powerful celestial engine that governs all things moist. To the medieval mind, the moon controls the tides, the growth of plants, and most importantly, the fluids inside your head. You remember the four humors, that internal plumbing system we've been monitoring all week? Well, the brain is considered the moistest organ in the body. Mainstream historical facts tell us that the word lunacy literally derives from the Latin luna. It was widely believed by doctors and theologians alike that the phases of the moon could cause the brain to ebb and flow just like the sea. If the moon is full, your brain is essentially at high tide, and all that extra fluid is currently sloshing against the walls of your rational soul, threatening to drown your common sense. You feel the silvery light on your face, and it feels cold, almost liquid. It's a sensory experience that is both beautiful and terrifying. In a world where the only other light comes from a guttering tallow candle or a smoky hearth, the full moon is like a giant celestial spotlight, but it's a spotlight with an agenda. Historians still argue whether lunacy was used as a specific medical diagnosis for what we might now call bipolar disorder, given its cyclical nature, or if it was simply a convenient legal term used to explain away any behavior that didn't fit the village's rigid social vibe. If you act weird only once a month, you aren't mad. You're just lunar. It's the original get out of jail free card, provided the moon is in the right position. But as you stand there, staring at the craters and shadows, you notice the neighbor, the blacksmith's son again, the one who saw you talking to the dandelions, watching you from his doorway. He doesn't see a person admiring the beauty of the cosmos. He sees someone whose brain tide is clearly coming in. To him, your vacant stare and tilted head are symptoms of a curdled brain. There is a quirky, fringe tidbit from medieval folklore that the man in the moon is actually a peasant who was caught gathering sticks on a Sunday and was banished to the sky as a permanent, glowing warning against breaking the Sabbath. By staring at him, you are technically engaging with a celestial criminal. It's guilt by association, but on a planetary scale. To help you visualize the social pressure of this moment, imagine if you were caught staring at a blank television screen for 4 hours while your neighbors watch through the window. They wouldn't think you were contemplating the void. They'd be calling for a wellness check. That's you right now. You are a system error in a landscape of shadows. You think back to the love sickness from earlier today. Remember the weaver's daughter and your leaping goat pulse? The moon is supposed to make that even worse. It stirs the blood and heats the spirit. You are a walking chemical reaction, and the moon is a catalyst. You feel a strange, airy lightness in your head, a feeling that your thoughts are starting to float away like dandelion seeds. You are porous again, and the moonlight is leaking in through your eyes. Medicine in this period would suggest that you shouldn't even be outdoors right now. Many people believe that sleeping in direct moonlight could literally warp your face or cause your humors to congeal into a permanent state of fatuity. There were even specific medical charts known as the Zodiac Man, which showed how different celestial bodies governed different parts of the body. The moon governed the brain, obviously, but also the stomach, which explains why that gray pottage always feels worse when the moon is bright. You are a celestial puppet, and the strings are being pulled by a giant white ball 238,000 miles away. You feel the itch of your wool tunic, the damp cold of the night air, and the smell of wood smoke, but they all feel distant, as if the moon has muted the volume of the earth. You try to look down, focusing on the dark mud at your feet. You need to look grounded. You need to look like someone who hates the sky. You think back to the glass delusion. Remember your fragile ribs? If the moon can move the entire ocean, it can certainly shatter a person made of glass. You feel a sudden, sharp anxiety. What if the moonlight makes you transparent? What if everyone can see the black bile swirling in your chest? The pressure of being observed by the heavens is just as bad as being observed by the blacksmith's son. You are caught in a crossfire of gazes, and your sanity is the only casualty. There is a light joke to be made about medieval astrology being the original Tinder bio. Instead of, "I like long walks and tacos," a medieval person might say, "I'm a sanguine personality with a lunar tendency, looking for someone who doesn't think my glass ribs are a deal breaker." It's a way of categorizing the chaos of the human mind, but it also makes every quirk a destiny. You aren't just moody, you are under the influence. You aren't just distracted, you are starstruck in the most literal medical sense possible. You realize that your normal behavior, the simple act of looking at the stars, has become a clinical symptom. You decide to go back inside. The moon is too loud tonight. It's shouting in a frequency you can't quite ignore. You step over the threshold of your hut, the darkness inside feeling like a warm, protective sleeve. You realize that in the Middle Ages, the dark isn't the scary part, it's the light that exposes you. Whether it's the light of God, the light of the law, or the light of the moon, it all feels like a searchlight looking for a reason to lock you up. You crawl back onto your straw mattress, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a glass person, call back alert, and try to close your eyes. But even with your eyes shut, you can still see the silvery glow through the gaps in the thatch. You feel the tide in your brain starting to recede, leaving behind a salty, bitter residue of melancholy. You realize that tomorrow is going to be a heavy day. The moon has finished stirring you, and now you have to deal with the sediment. You think about the dancing woman, the bell voices, and the weaver's daughter. They are all just patterns in the lunar static. You are a rational soul trying to navigate a celestial ocean in a boat made of leaky wool. And as you drift towards sleep, you just hope that by morning, the tide has gone out far enough for you to find your feet again. You wake up with the sun, but the lunar tide from last night has left a sticky, gray residue on your conscience. You feel like you've committed a high-stakes felony, but for the life of you, you can't remember what it was. Did you look at the moon too long? Probably. Did you think about the weaver's daughter? Remember those copper curls? With a bit too much sanguine enthusiasm? Definitely. But then you remember the real crime. Yesterday, while walking past the market, you saw a single, slightly bruised grape that had fallen from a merchant's cart. It was sitting there in the dust, looking lonely and neglected. You picked it up. You ate it. And now you are convinced that this 1 gram serving of fermented fruit has fundamentally corrupted your soul and invited a cosmic audit of your entire existence. In your modern life, this is called scrupulosity, a subset of obsessive compulsive disorder where your brain becomes a hypervigilant hall monitor for your own morality. You'd probably talk to a therapist about intrusive thoughts or moral anxiety. But here in the 14th century, you aren't anxious. You are scrupulous. The word comes from the Latin scrupulus, meaning a small, sharp stone. It's a perfect description for that nagging, jagged feeling in your shoe, or in this case, your soul, that makes every step a misery. You feel the sharp stone of that grape digging into your psyche. You start to wonder, was it really a stray grape? Or was it a test? Did the merchant see me? Did God see me? Does the grape have a family that is now grieving its loss? It sounds ridiculous to a rational mind, but your mind currently has the blue screen of death when it comes to rationality. Mainstream historical facts tell us that scrupulosity became a massive epidemic of the mind after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which made annual confession mandatory for every Christian. Suddenly, everyone had to keep a literal spreadsheet of sins in their head. For most people, this was just a yearly chore, like doing your taxes. But for someone with your porous and melancholic history, it turned into a 24/7 internal audit. You are now a spiritual accountant who has lost the ability to round up. You spend your morning hoeing the garden. Remember the dandelions? But you aren't thinking about the weeds. You're thinking about whether your hoeing is a form of pride, because you're trying to make your garden look better than the blacksmith's. You are alienated from the simple act of existing because every action is a potential glitch in the divine law. Historians still argue whether the medieval rise in scrupulosity was a byproduct of an increasingly legalistic church, or if it was actually the first large-scale documentation of what we now recognize as clinical OCD. Was a culture creating the madness, or was the madness just finding a theological language to express itself? You look at your hands, those dirt-stained tools of your trade. They feel unclean, but not because of the mud. You feel like you need to wash them 100 times to get the grape guilt off. This is the sensory reality of your condition, the feeling that your skin is a sin magnet. And the only way to stay safe is to stop moving, stop thinking, and stop being. You are back to the glass delusion state, callback. Only instead of being afraid of breaking, you're afraid of staining. To help you visualize the sheer mental exhaustion of this, imagine if every single thought you had was immediately posted to a public Twitter feed that was being monitored by a very grumpy judge with the power to sentence you to eternity in a basement. You'd be terrified to even blink. That's your life in this village. You walk toward the church, the smell of incense and old stone pulling at you. You need to confess. You need a system restore. But the problem with scrupulosity is that once you start confessing, you can't stop. You confess the grape. Then you confess that you might have enjoyed the grape too much. Then you confess that you might be lying about how much you enjoyed the grape. It's a recursive loop of anxiety that would make a modern computer processor catch fire. There's a quirky, fringe tidbit about the extreme penances some scrupulous people would perform. Some were so terrified of unconscious sins that they would tie bells to their fingers to wake themselves up if they started having a sinful dream. Remember your flying dream? Others believed that if they swallowed a fly while fasting, they had technically broken their fast and would spend hours debating with the priest whether the fly counted as meat or accident. You consider this as you watch a fly buzz around your head. If it lands on your lip, is that a temptation? You are living in a world of microaggressions where the aggressor is your own brain. To give you a modern comparison, being scrupulous is like having a security software on your laptop that is so sensitive it flags your own wallpaper as a virus. You can't get any work done because the moral firewall is blocking everything, including your own breathing. You reach the church door, feeling the cold iron of the handle. It feels heavy, like the weight of 1,000 stolen grapes. You see the priest, the one with the red nose who thinks your bell voices are a problem. He looks at you with a mix of pity and not this again exhaustion. To him, you aren't a sinner, you're a nuisance. He's a tech support for a soul that keeps crashing, and he's running out of reboot strategies. The sensory experience of the confessional is a dark, cramped box that smells of stale breath and wood polish. You whisper your sins through the screen, your voice shaking. You tell him about the grape. You tell him about the dandelions. You tell him about the way the moon looked at you last night. He sighs. A long, weary sound that reminds you of the shoosh, shoosh of the wind. He tells you to say 10 Ave Marias and go home, but you don't feel better. You feel like you forgot to mention the way you stepped on a beetle on the way in. Was the beetle innocent? Did it have a soul? The loop starts again. You are a rational soul being eaten alive by irrational guilt. You realize that sanity in the Middle Ages is the ability to be comfortably dirty. To be sane is to accept that you are a miserable sinner and just get on with your day. But you can't. You are too porous to the law. You think back to the gift of tears. Remember how crying was a release? Your guilt is the opposite. It's a clog. It's the black bile of the conscience. You walk out of the church, the bright sunlight making you flinch. You feel exposed, transparent, glass callback, and monitored. You look at the mud on your boots and realize that the only way to be clean is to not exist at all. As you trudge back toward your garden, you see the dancing woman again. She looks exhausted, but she also looks free. Her mind is gone, her rational soul has left the building, and she doesn't care about grapes or dandelions or beetles. For a split second, you envy her madness. Her system failure is a loud, violent dance. Yours is a quiet, agonizing audit. You take a deep breath, trying to settle your scrupulosity, and realize that tomorrow is the final day of your mental journey. You have been through the fire, the water, the glass, and the bile. You are a survivor of the medieval mind, and as the shadows of the church stretch out once more, you realize that the peace you're looking for isn't in a confessional. It's in the silence that comes when the hall monitor finally goes to sleep. You walk back toward your hut, your feet finding the familiar, weary rhythm of the mud for what feels like the thousandth time. The grape guilt and the lunar static are still there, humming at the edges of your awareness, but they feel different now, like a radio station that's finally losing its signal as you drive further into the mountains. The sensory assault of the village, the smell of overboiled pottage, the clink-clink of the blacksmith's hammer, and the judgmental gaze of the priest is beginning to soften. You realize that you have spent an entire week living inside a diagnostic manual of medieval madness. You have been a mourner, a dreamer, a wanderer, a piece of glass, and a celestial receiver. In your modern life, you'd be looking for a very long vacation and a very strong prescription. But here, you are simply a person who has reached the edge of their capacity to care about the rules of the soul. You stop at the threshold of your home and look back at the village one last time. In the fading light, the timber-framed houses look like a collection of fragile bird cages. Mainstream historical facts remind us that for most people in the Middle Ages, there was no cure for the types of mental distress you've experienced, only management. You weren't fixed, you were simply incorporated into the tapestry of the community until you either recovered or became a holy fool at the edge of the woods. Historians still argue whether this communal acceptance of eccentricity was more humane than our modern system of clinical isolation. While they had leeches and hot irons, they also had a place for the glass person and the dreamer at the communal table. You realize that your alienation was actually a very crowded experience. You were never truly alone in your madness. You were just the latest person to take a turn on the tightrope of sanity. There is a quirky, fringe belief that some medieval thinkers held. The idea that finesse of the mind was actually a bridge to the next world. They believed that those whose humors were unbalanced were actually more sensitive to the movement of the spheres. If that's true, then your black bile wasn't a curse. It was an antenna. You think back to the dancing woman. Remember her? Maybe she wasn't seizing. Maybe she was just the only one who could hear the background hum of the universe. You feel a strange, quiet mirth, sardonic chuckle callback at the thought. You step inside your hut, and for the first time, the darkness doesn't feel like a prison of bile. It feels like an invitation. The sensory details of your room are finally starting to dim. The scratchy wool of your tunic feels like it's becoming part of the shadows. The smell of the damp earth is no longer a sign of decay. It's just the scent of the ground waiting to hold you. You lie down on your straw mattress, your protective packaging for your glass ribs, and you feel the kalma and tension leaking out of your joints. You aren't leaking your soul anymore. You are just letting go. You realize that normal was never a destination. It was just a performance you were too tired to give. As you close your eyes, the bell voices and the lunar tide fade into a single, steady frequency of peace. You have survived the Middle Ages, and now the Middle Ages are letting you rest. The world of the village is drifting away now, the heavy wooden buckets and the muddy pads dissolving into a soft gray mist. You can no longer hear the priest's sighs or the blacksmith's hammer. The pressure to be sane has evaporated, leaving behind only the gentle, rhythmic sound of your own breathing. It's a slow, steady pulse, far removed from the leaping goat of your lovesickness or the frantic rhythm of the dance. You are safe. You are back in the quiet center of yourself where no hall monitor can follow. The air around you feels cool and light like the wind in your hair from that first flying dream. You aren't falling. You are just settling into the soft velvet darkness of a sleep that doesn't require diagnosis. Everything is becoming distant and muffled, like the sound of a bell ringing 3 villages away. The itchy wool has turned to silk. The hard ground has turned to cloud. You feel a deep, comforting warmth spreading through your glass ribs, turning the transparency into a solid, heavy sense of belonging. The black bile has been washed away by a tide of pure, quiet stillness. You are no longer a system error, you are a finished story. The images of the day, the turnip nose count, the weaver's daughter, the stray grape, are all flickering out like guttering candles. One by one, the lights of the medieval world are going dark, leaving you in a perfect, wordless silence. Your thoughts are slowing down, stretching out into long, languid ripples like a pond after a stone has settled. There is no more scrupulosity, no more moral audit, no more searching for signs. There is only the dark. There is only the quiet. You are drifting now, floating on a sea that has no tides and no moon. The spirits have gone home. The humors are balanced. You are just a soul resting in the hollow of the night. Sleep is coming for you like a kind friend, wrapping you in a blanket made of stars and silence. You are home, you are whole, you are asleep. As the final echoes of the village fade, let your mind become as still as the surface of a deep forest pool at midnight. The weight of the world, with all its judgment and its complicated rules, has been lifted from your shoulders, leaving you as light as a feather caught in a gentle updraft. There are no more roles to play, no more gazes to avoid, and no more voices to interpret. You are drifting in a timeless space where the air is cool and the darkness is a soft, protective embrace. Feel the gentle rise and fall of your chest, a slow and steady tide that carries you further and further away from the noise of the day. The memories of the mud and the stone are dissolving into a dreamless, velvety peace. You are perfectly safe, perfectly quiet, and perfectly still. The journey is over, the path has ended, and the only thing left is the beautiful, dark hum of a deep and restful sleep. Let yourself go into that silence, sinking down into the softest parts of the night, where the only thing that exists is the quiet rhythm of your own heart. Everything is as it should be, the world is at rest, and so are you.